So the theme of asking how we can move beyond Eurocentrism and nationalism in the context of migration law and studies and beyond is of course an urgent question. And I hope that what I have to say today will be some small contribution to the collective thinking that I know will be going on and the discussions that will be going on throughout the conference. And I'm going to address the question of how to move beyond by first going back, which I think is necessary to understand what has come before and how we got to where we are now in order to be able to then think and strategize and organize our way out of it. And of course, I'm really aware that as I'm speaking today, as we are all thinking in these days about thinking beyond nationalism and Eurocentrism in migration, it's at the same time as a humanitarian crisis or disaster is fast escalating at the EU's external border with Belarus. And although its immediate causes may lie in recent political developments, and certainly there is a lot of deflective and distractive language around what is happening, I hope that what I will have to say today will provide us with maybe a bit of a longer view in terms of trying to understand crises or things that seem momentary problems or issues that arise, but that are actually not really aberrations, but part of a long history which doesn't tend to get acknowledged. And I think that this history is important to understanding how racialized people are dying at the EU's borders in plain sight, as we're speaking now, with no sign of action being taken to stop this, aside, of course, in terms of the question I'm talking about at the Polish-Belarusian border, is what's happening on the ground, where much of the action tends to take place. The remedial action, I mean, of local communities stepping in to do what they can, even though they're totally unequipped to deal with what is happening there, making sure that people can get through and survive ever colder nights. So today I'm going to be talking about a particular moment of transition, as mentioned, that of European empires into European community, and how this lesser known or acknowledged history of racial exclusion helps to explain Europe's contemporary practices of exclusion, and indeed indicate that the EU itself can be seen to embody a continuity of colonialism. So I'm going to attempt to challenge the mythological mainstream narrative on European integration, that it was solely about heralding in a new dawn of peace, democracy, and human rights. The reality, of course, is that there was much more going on, that the European Union's foundations lie in the colonial histories of its founding member states, an origin story with which the EU and its member states have not grappled with. So European integration, rather than marking a turning point or rupture in relation to a violent past, is instead on a continuum of European colonialism. Just as European countries passed immigration and nationality legislation designed to exclude racialized colony citizens in the face of the defeat of their empires, European colonial powers came together in the post-war era to create a protectionist bloc to ensure that the spoils of European colonialism remained the domain of white Europeans. And I'll begin with a brief quote from Frantz Fanon. He writes, "Leave this Europe where they are never done talking of man, yet murder men everywhere they find them, at the corner of every one of their own streets, in all the corners of the globe." And Fanon's illustration of Europe as a violent set of colonial powers is in stark contrast with the European Union's idealized self-image as a bastion of liberal civilization, a defender of democracy and human rights. The mainstream narrative on the history of European integration is that its architects sought to build on what are assumed to be quintessentially European ideals about democracy, freedom, and also and the idea was to build a future of peace and security. But the colonial origins and identity of the EU tend not to be accounted for in the histories, the written histories that we present our students with in our courses, that the EU presents to the world in terms of its own narrative on its formation. Indeed, some widely cited texts dismiss altogether the importance of geopolitics in general and colonialism in particular, focusing instead only on economic rationales in explaining the formation of the Union. While Europe's history does include the Reformation and the Enlightenment and a number of revolutions, each of which inscribed in European identity progressive and universalist goals, coterminous with this history is one of colonial violence and theft. Europe's appeal to notions of liberty and equality has always coexisted with imperial wars and dispossession. Its founders drew on traditions that were undemocratic, militaristic, imperialistic, and Christian supremacist. At the core of the European project was the fortification of a space of white European supremacy in an era in which European colonialism was facing defeat. The idea that European integration was a desperate attempt by European colonial powers to regroup in the face of threats to its global supremacy was captured by former Belgian Prime Minister Paul-Henri Spaak speaking at the occasion of the establishment of the Council of Europe in 1948. 150 million Europeans, he declared, have not the right to feel inferior to anyone. Do you hear? There is no great country in this world that can look down on 150 million Europeans who close their ranks in order to save themselves. Similar to Britain's seizure of colonial spoils via the passing of immigration and nationality legislation in the course of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, a process I trace in my book, the origins of the European Union lie in a turn towards protectionism in an effort to seal off Europe's stolen riches in the face of victories over European colonialism worldwide. Etienne Balibar has argued that the European Union never transcended its colonial past, that the colonial castes of the various nationalities, French, Dutch, Portuguese, worked together to forge the idea of white superiority of civilizations as an interest that has to be defended against the savages. This representation, the white man's burden, has contributed in a decisive way to molding the modern notion of a supranational European or Western identity. So the colonial garrison was where European identity was first forged. As Jared Delanty has shown, in its confrontation with non-Christian civilizations, Europe sought to construct a hegemonic identity as one representing freedom, progress, civilization, and Christian humanism. By portraying the Orient as despotic and morally backward, the Christian West was able to justify its imperialistic drive. Racism, whether anti-Black, anti-Muslim, or anti-Semitic, is thus not recent or incidental to contemporary Europe, but has long been the means through which European powers have installed white supremacy at home and abroad. As Alana Lenton explains, the modern European project of constructing a general idea of man necessitates including a reference point, the non-human. It's estimated that the arrival of Europeans in the Americas, for instance, in 1492, led to 56 million deaths by 1600 and impacted the Earth's climate in the 2 centuries prior to the Industrial Revolution. Despite the well-rehearsed account of the history of European integration, both in official and scholarly terms, that it was embarked on in the interest of lasting peace and security, European militaristic imperialism remains unabated. The Algerian War, which killed more than 1 million people, is not cited as a breach of the peace promised by European integration. Indeed, although Algeria was just as much a part of France as Brittany, despite the French government's assertion in 1954 that Algeria is part of France, its status as a colony with a majority Muslim and racialized population meant that it was not included in the white Christian supremacist European integration project. Peace in Algeria was not prioritized, nor was Algeria deemed to qualify as a recipient of the benefits of EEC membership. Although it was recognized as part of France and Algerians as French citizens, negotiations yielded the outcome that the EEC principle of free movement of workers would not extend to Algerian workers. Member states continue to take military action against non-EU member states, and the EU has no inbuilt structural component that is capable of preventing this. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 by a handful of European governments in collaboration with the US the death toll of which is estimated at more than 2 million, along with France's periodic interventions in Mali, for instance, demonstrate that the peace at the heart of the European project is promised only to the predominantly white European citizens living within the borders of member countries, while murderous imperialism continues elsewhere. Indeed, as Therese Johnson has argued, the cost of stability within Europe is instability beyond its borders. Colonialism was firmly in situ at the time of the EEC's formation. The Paris Agreement of 1957 saw EEC member states include in the draft Treaty of Rome a set of special measures related to colonial investment concerning half the African continent and parts of the West Indies and Oceania. The Rome Treaty's accommodation of colonialism meant that the 3/4 of the EEC's landmass was located beyond the borders of continental Europe. Despite the omission of the colonial in mainstream accounts of European integration, the European press at the time of the agreement of 1957 Rome Treaty highlighted as one of the most important aspects of the treaty the EEC's creation of Eurafrica, a colonial policy that would see the African continent exploited for its labor and resources in the interests of growing European economies. Eurafrica was promoted on the basis that it could provide Europe with raw materials for its industry, nutrition for its population, land for its overpopulation, labor for its unemployed, and markets for its products. Yet the emphasis in mainstream historical narratives of European integration is often, as I mentioned, on its economic drivers as these pertain to the creation of the European single market, and neglect its racial and capitalist dimensions. It is no coincidence that racial capitalism emerged in Western Europe and now finds its expression in European integration. Cedric Robinson argued that capitalism developed within a context of feudalism in a Europe that was already racially stratified. The first European proletarians were racial subjects, Irish, Jews, Roma. Rather than being a break from feudalism, capitalism and racism evolved from it to produce a modern world system of racial capitalism, dependent on slavery, violence, imperialism, and genocide. As Robin Kelly explains, capitalism's role has not been to homogenize, but to differentiate, to exaggerate regional, subcultural, and dialectical differences into racial ones. Thus, as Gargi Bhattacharya argues on her work in racial capitalism, capitalism as we have known it has had only this racialized trajectory of global development in coincidence with the period of the racialized demarcation of the world. The operation of racial capitalism has always depended upon particular institutions such as markets and law in its claim to embody norms of universalism, equality, neutrality, and rationality, serves to legitimize the global system of racial capitalism. Peo Hansen and Stefan Jonsson have argued that the 1957 Rome Treaty's incorporation of the colonial project of Eurafrica had the effect of ensuring a continuation of old relations of dominance even under the new system. They describe Eurafrica as an institution of a transitory character, a vanishing mediator. It functioned as a historical catalyst which facilitated a smooth passage from empire to European integration. Once it had served its purpose of sustaining existing relations of dominance, Eurafrica vanishes, thus creating the impression of a historical break or discontinuity between colonial and post-colonial, pre- and post-European integration, white supremacy and partnership, colonial exploitation and development, civilizing mission, and third world aid. Yet the EU was then, as it is now, an imperial entity. The fact that many member states still have overseas colonial territories is something of an open secret. The geographical reach of contemporary colonial Europe is neither depicted in maps which claim to show European Union territory, nor in the European imaginary. Statistical information provided by the European Commission frequently excludes acknowledgement of the populations of overseas territory despite their European status. The transition from empires to union fostered a climate in which member states neither had to reflect on nor account for colonialism and its legacies. Over the course of European integration, a profound colonial amnesia has set in, reflected in dominant accounts of the EU's formation. The vacuum in recollections has in turn facilitated a colonial nostalgia and ambition, which we of course saw in the British context not so long ago. And these are sentiments that have also been allowed to fester in the European Union, which refuses to avow its violent origins. So I'm now going to turn to some concrete examples from EU law to illustrate some of the points made above, to show how the EU's imperial history continues to shape its present as a racially exclusive one. Taken together, Article 18, 20, and 21 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union comprise EU citizenship and establish the rights that stem from it. Article 21 of the TFEU sets out European citizenship. As citizenship of the Union is hereby established, every person holding the nationality of a member state shall be a citizen of the Union. Citizenship of the Union shall be additional to and not replace national citizenship. So EU citizenship, as we know, is derivative of member state nationality. This is important because it means that EU citizenship doesn't pose a challenge to member state articulations of nationality law. So member states' exclusive post-colonial national boundaries are thus accommodated within the framework of EU law. The racially exclusive dimensions of the principle of free movement are well illustrated with reference to the story of Britain's entry into the EEC. Faced with the prospect of British membership, member states were concerned about colony and Commonwealth citizens entering the Union. The British government made sure to clarify that insofar as the EEC was concerned, and particularly the right of free movement of persons, its nationals were those with a right of abode in Britain. And I'll come to the meaning of that in a moment. It attached a declaration on the definition of the term nationals to its accession treaty with the EU. Fellow EEC member states were willing to accept the declaration on the meaning of a British national on condition that it excluded Commonwealth citizens outside Britain. The declaration states that the term nationals of the member states is understood to refer to persons who are citizens of the United Kingdom and colonies or British subjects not possessing that citizenship or the citizenship of any other Commonwealth country or territory, who in either case have the right of abode in the United Kingdom and are therefore exempt from United Kingdom immigration control. So the definition of a British national for the purposes of EEC law was the same as that set out in the 1971 Immigration Act, which came into force on the 1st of January 1973, which was the same date as the entry into force of Britain's accession treaty. The definition excluded many Commonwealth citizens living in Britain at the time. Essentially, the definition was based on this concept of patriality, which said that a patrial, a person with a right of abode, i.e. a right of entry and stay in Britain, was a person who was born in Britain or with a parent born in Britain. And at that time, in 1971, a person born in Britain was 98% likely to be white. So one commentator captured the influence of the colonial mindset in Britain on the determination of the scope of the declaration in 1973, stating it would certainly not please the anti-immigration lobby in Britain to have economic, social, and legal rights extended to the Black British, which would put them on a par with the white British, nor would it please the racialist element in the community countries to see Black British people grasping the opportunity to work on the continent. The fact that the British government made the declaration on acceding to the EEC is indicative of the community's concern about colony and Commonwealth subjects' potential claims to Europeanness as a result of the existence of a multitude of contested claims to Britishness stemming from its colonial status and history. The derivative nature of the concept of EU citizenship has been upheld in the case law of the Court of Justice of the European Union. In the 2001 case of Kaur, concerning the case of Miss Manjit Kaur, who was born in Kenya and lost her right to enter and live in Britain following the 1971 Immigration Act because she was not a patrial, she fell outside the scope of the definition of a member state national for the purposes of EEC law. In 1996, Ms. Kaur applied for leave to remain in Britain and was refused. The High Court to which she applied for judicial review of this decision referred a question to the Court of Justice on the matter relating to the application of EEC law. She argued that she wanted to travel and work in other member states. Her position was that although a member state can define a concept of nationality, it can only do so in observance of the fundamental rights which form part of EEC law. She asserted that British nationality law infringed fundamental rights by depriving her, as she was categorized an overseas British citizen, of the right to enter the territory of which they are nationals, and rendered her effectively stateless. The British government defended its decision to refuse her leave to remain on the basis that she had no close connection with Britain and was one of many people who, as a result of its imperial history, retained some form of link with Britain, despite never having lived there. The Court of Justice, ruling on the matter, accepted the British government's argument, saying that it is for each member state, having due regard to community law, to lay down the conditions for the acquisition and loss of nationality. It considered that Britain had, on the basis of customary international law and in the light of its imperial and colonial past, defined several categories of British citizens whom it recognized as having rights which differ according to the nature of the ties connecting them to Britain. So the court accepted that the 1971 Immigration Act's rationale was to reserve the right of abode to those citizens who had the closest connection to Britain. In doing so, the court accepted patriality, that is the connection to whiteness that Britishness demanded, which was passed in the 1971 Immigration Act. It accepted this connection to whiteness as being the legitimate basis of belonging in Britain and by implication in the EEC. The Court of Justice's wholly deferential attitude towards British immigration and nationality laws serves to legitimize their colonially appropriative effects. EU law thus not only fails to challenge ongoing colonial violence in the form of member state immigration and nationality laws, it also reinforces and reproduces that violence within the EU, creating it as a racially exclusive space. The story about Ms. Kaur leads us to the legal category of European Union citizen and its racially exclusive effects. The legal benefits that stem from European citizenship include, first and foremost, that of free movement and non-discrimination. Article 21 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union states that every citizen of the Union shall have the right to move and reside freely within the territory of the member state, subject to limitations and conditions laid out in the treaties. Article 2.5 of the Schengen Borders Code defines persons enjoying the right of free movement under Union law as first and foremost EU citizens, on whose rights non-EU nationals who are family members can then piggyback under certain conditions, and nationals of select states with which the EU has negotiated agreements. EU citizens are predominantly white, and the vast majority of those who take up their right to free movement are white. Adam Weiss has argued that white skin facilitates the movement of white Europeans within the EU, allowing them to fit wherever they go, inside or outside their country of nationality. European citizenship thus has a close affinity with whiteness. Phil Nabashi has argued that the clear preference among European states for white migration constructs white people as occupying a position at the top of two intersecting hierarchical systems. One is a racial system and the other a hierarchy of nations. The protectionist European project thus necessitates the exclusion of non-members and the prioritization of the interests of member states. This is reflected in the principle of mutual recognition under EU law, the idea that member states are to permit the entry of workers trained and products sold in other member states to circulate freely on their territories. Underpinning the principle is the assumption that goods are of a high quality simply by virtue of originating in the EU, and similarly that workers trained in the EU are necessarily better qualified than those trained elsewhere. The implication is that the same assumption cannot be made for persons and goods from outside the EU, which are presented as being potentially threatening to service users or hazardous to consumers. By contrast, discrimination by member states against citizens of other member states is taken seriously under EU law. Article 18 declares that within the scope of application of the treaties and without prejudice to any special provisions contained therein, any discrimination on the grounds of nationality shall be prohibited. Patricia Tuitt has argued that the principle of free movement of persons has allowed the European Union to expand territorially and thus locates the project of European integration on a continuum of imperialism. Far from witnessing the birth of a political community without historical precedent, she writes, the origins of the European Union are distressingly familiar. The Rome Treaty generated the beginnings of a political force that gestures towards the age of discovery. For Tuitt, the centrality of the principle of free movement to European unity, along with the doctrine of direct effect, which allows European citizens to invoke their rights under EU law and national courts, means that the success of the European project depends on it being taken up by European citizens themselves. Thus, the appropriation of Europe to the exigencies of the European Union has occurred in the time-honored fashion of encouraging the most courageous, most often the most economically advantaged, to test new spaces to discover to what extent its seeming dissolution can yield yet hidden riches. For those who qualify as EU citizens, movement to another EU member state may provide opportunities for the betterment of lives. When considered alongside the position of those without a legal status under EU law, including those who must travel in an irregularized manner, making dangerous journeys in an attempt to reach European shores, EU citizenship emerges as a hyper-privileged category. Article 19 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union empowers the Union to take action against racial discrimination, and a directive exists prohibiting race discrimination. However, it is rarely enforced. Article 10 on the Treaty on the European Union states that in defining and implementing its policies and activities, the Union shall aim to combat discrimination based on sex, racial or ethnic origin, religion or belief, disability, age, or sexual orientation. Thus, while yeah, sure, yeah.
Sorry, it's difficult because I cannot find eye contact with you. Can you wrap up within like 3 minutes or so that we have some time to discuss?
Yep. Sure.
Wonderful, thank you.
Okay, in that case, I will skip to the bit on the border. So rather than transcending the excesses of Europe's past, the project of European integration has bolstered the structures of global inequality left in place by colonialism. Intrinsic to the making and maintaining of itself as a space of white European supremacy, we have seen the EU's abolition of internal frontiers and the fortification of its external borders. We've seen the way in which an internally borderless Europe has required the policing of the borders at the external boundary of the Union and the impact that this has had. And membership, of course, has always required border states to heighten the policing of the EU's external borders, which were perceived as being needed as flanking measures in relation for reducing for removing borders internally. But of course, the borders of the European Union are not preordained. With its colonial past in mind, the EU must be understood as an appropriated continent. Its borders lie wherever those with power choose to put them and cast them in concrete and barbed wire. Meanwhile, overseas colonial territories are made invisible through selective and inaccurate cartography and scholarly accounts. And of course, we've seen the effects of the EU's external bordering, and I'll just cite the current deaths that are reported to have taken place since counting in 1993 is over 40,000. I think if we take into account what's happening at the EU external border at the moment, plus the trends that we've seen in increasing deaths of individuals trying to reach the EU, I think that we can see that in the absence of radical reformulation in the project of European integration can't provide an adequate alternative to the excesses of the nation state. So thinking how to move beyond it, beyond Eurocentrism and beyond the nation state becomes an ever urgent project, because of course, as European nations turn further inward on themselves, the violent effects of their colonial exploits continue to be felt viscerally across the world and at their own borders. There's a direct causal link between European colonialism and ongoing global wealth disparity and inequality in income and land distribution in former colonies. Poverty, dispossession, and an exponentially high mortality rate are lasting legacies for populations in former colonies. The long-term mainstreaming of nationalist ideas in popular and official discourse has caused a frightening global surge in right-wing populism and authoritarian government. We are in dire need of an unsettling of what Siva Mohan Vallabhan has called the clamour of nationalism. And if we can work to provide urgently needed counter-histories and narratives to those we are offered by the mainstream political and media discourse daily, we might be able to begin to work our way out of the violence and ensnarement of the nation state and its dangerous ideological counterpart of nationalism, a politics of exclusion that European integration has been unable to counter. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Nadine, for this impressive overview of European history in just less than half an hour. We now have a few minutes to take some questions from the audience. I want to invite both people who are present here and in the small room next door, as well as people online, to please ask questions, make comments, share your thoughts. If you're still collecting your thoughts, I might just start. Nadine, listening to you, you paint a very bleak picture of the state of EU migration law. And listening to you, it does sound like the system is beyond repair, so that it is irreparably colonial and racist, right? So what, in terms of thinking, indeed, of approaches that could help, move beyond that past, what can be done? Does it really require overcoming, the nation state? So is it that radical, or is there something else? Is there something else that we can do beyond acknowledging the bleak situation?
Well, I think that actually acknowledging, I mean, it is a bleak history, so it's difficult to tell it in a non-bleak way, but I think that acknowledging it is quite a radical step, actually, because I don't think that it is acknowledged in the places where it needs to be acknowledged. And I mean that in terms of school curricula, I mean that in terms of the media, I mean that in terms of the kind of what we would put on a required reading list for a migration course in most universities across the continent. And then, of course, up to the officials and the institutions that we're talking about. I think that that acknowledgement would actually be a huge step, because then we wouldn't be speaking around issues as they're happening, as they're in urgent need of address, but we would be kind of stating very evidently what is happening. And it's only by stating what's happening can you then strategize solutions. And I'm not completely not hopeful, in the sense that we've also seen over the past year, Black Lives Matter. We've seen uprisings within the UK in relation to anti-racism, but also across Europe. At the time that statues were being pulled down in Britain, the same thing was happening in other European countries. And I take all of these kind of collective demonstrations of acknowledgement of this history and also its relevance to the contemporary moment as being massive progress. And I take great heart and hope from them. And I also think that practitioners working within the system are aware, maybe better than any of us, about the violence of the system and how it works from within, even though they have to do their really crucial work on a day-to-day basis, which I also regard as really crucial work of representing individuals, making sure their claims are heard, and scholars making arguments about how we can better interpret legislation in order to ensure that people's claims are met and people can meet criteria for legal status. But I think there's a long way to go in acknowledging, and I would guess I wouldn't say it's a small step. And I also think there are resistance movements we can look to for hope in the points that are being made to kind of try and shift and change mindsets, but also political positions on this.
Great, thank you. Are there any questions in the room? I can see one in the back and then one in the front here as well. Do you mind, Nadine, if we collect the two of them and that you answer them both? Okay.
Thank you very much. You gave very, very convincing presentation about colonial and the persistence of colonial relationships between certain EU member states and non-EU member states. But I'm a little bit curious if you think that there is something possible like colonial relationships within the European Union. I'm thinking of, let's say, Germany and Greece, or Germany and Romania and Bulgaria, or Germany and certain of southeastern candidate states or former Yugoslavia, because if that would be the case, that there are colonial relationships between EU member states and non-member states, and also between EU member states and other member states, I think that would render the whole picture about European integration that you were presenting a little bit more complicated, because it binds together member states that have colonial ties with, let's say, Africa or Asia or areas all around the world, and member states who might use or might perceive the EU as some sort of, rather Hinterhof, their colonial
backyard. Yeah, thank you.
Backyard.
Thanks. Thank you very much for that question. And then we have one from Francesca.
Hi Nadine, I'm Paula and I'm actually from Namibia. And I was listening to your presentation, which I think was really good, but I was just wondering, and it's pretty much related to the previous question, is that when you're speaking about white, are you speaking about physical features? Are you talking about bloodline? Are you talking about country? What is your definition of white? Because if white is on physical features, are we under the assumption that there is a universal consensus of what white means as a race? That's the question. I hope it's clear.
Thank you. Just a brief question, and probably it relates to the question around, is there the European perspective? During your presentation, thank you very much. It was like really amazing. I had to think about Jimmy, who obviously argued that already in the 1990s, there was created this narrative or this myth of difference after the Cold War between obviously refugees from socialist states and refugees from the global south, and this myth of difference was basically the basis for racialized exclusion and racism. And I was wondering, obviously in Germany, this is quite present the topic. How do you see it from a UK perspective? And what do you think, how should we address memory after Cold War, having this colonial background in mind? And actually, does it change anything on how we think about current conflicts in Europe? For example, the border in Poland. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Petra. Nadine, please, you have 3 questions.
Thanks very much for all those questions. They're all really important. I mean, the first question, I agree with you that there are definitely hierarchies of power, of course, within the European Union, hierarchies of inequality or differential equality between member states, and also, as we saw in the wake of the financial crisis, the way in which great violence can come from that level of inequality and control that we have within the European Union. And of course, even in relation to migration policy specifically, it's very clear which countries kind of tend to push EU policy in this area, in particular restrictive dimensions at different points. And so I think it's a really interesting question, and I think it's absolutely right. But then again, I find it quite unsurprising that stemming from an era of competitive colonialism, in which certain countries were the winners or the successful countries, particularly successful in the era of competitive colonialism, then were vying for a position of power within the European community or the European Union. Indeed, in the arguments made for the UK joining the EU, UK officials were saying, whoever leads the European Union will lead the world. And this is, of course, exactly that colonial mentality, that colonial mindset, that imperial ambition kind of filtering its way into then the EU structure and membership, and how one would exploit its membership to then exercise certain power in relation to other member states. And then, of course, you would get the patterns and the hierarchies that one is familiar with in colonialism outside also being replicated and reproduced within. And that's also the kind of argument that I was making around the derivative nature of EU citizenship. It comes to uphold the discrimination that exists within member states rather than to pose a challenge to it. And I suppose I'd say the same for the sort of general structure of the EU as you were speaking about. In relation to the question about race and whiteness, my understanding of race is that it is a fluid concept. So I use Stuart Hall's idea of race as a floating signifier. It is not something that is ever set in stone. I couldn't give you a definition of whiteness. I couldn't give you a definition of race because it's always changing. Who is considered white can be one thing in one period and another in another. And of course, there are proximities to whiteness. There are and that shifts and changes. And of course, that's something that we have to be really aware of when we're talking about free movement and within a European context, because we may say there are white Europeans, but some Europeans are whiter than others in terms of the access to material resources, and which is what comes of whiteness. Whiteness as property, to use kind of Cheryl Harris's idea. And of course, racialization, the definition I use of racism is Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition around vulnerability, group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. So again, this is shifting, it changes. Who is more vulnerable shifts, and the definition of race shifts. So I couldn't give you a definition, but that's just to kind of give you a very quick summary of the theoretical framework that I'm using on understanding race. Finally, I think I'd probably just reiterate to the last question in terms of how we address memory. I think we're in a better place now. I don't think that, you know, when B.S. Chimney were writing, we're at the same kind of juncture. I think that, like I was saying, I think there is progress in terms of the acknowledgement of these histories and how important they are and how much they matter to understanding violence in the contemporary moment, to when maybe that writing first emerged. So I think that we're a bit along, but I think we're still nowhere near the level of acknowledgement and then the action that would hopefully follow, whether in the form of reparations, but obviously in my view, we need something much broader than that. But we're not even at the place where that kind of the political will or the general kind of state of mind around histories of colonialism and their relevance to the present day and their need for accountability and remediation. We're not really even at that moment.